At 10:42 p.m., Michael Bennett's phone buzzed while he sat alone in his garage near Charleston Harbor repairing an old Zenith radio that had not worked properly in years. Rain tapped softly against the metal garage door. A half-finished cup of coffee sat cold beside a pile of screwdrivers while an old country station crackled through static. Michael almost ignored the phone. Then he saw the message. 3 words. Dad, Blue Harbor. A live location pin appeared underneath it. Emily's house in Mount Pleasant. Michael froze instantly. Not because he did not understand the message, because he understood it too well. 22 years earlier, after Emily lost her mother unexpectedly, she became terrified of being alone. One sleepless night when she was only 12 years old, she asked him something he never forgot. What if someday I'm scared and don't know how to say it? So they created a private emergency code, Blue Harbor. It meant, don't ask questions, don't waste time, just come. And now, after more than 2 decades, his daughter was using it again. Michael called her immediately, straight to voicemail. He called again. Nothing. By the 3rd call, he was already grabbing his truck keys. Outside, the rain had become heavier, washing across the dark Charleston streets while thunder rolled somewhere over the harbor. Michael backed out of his driveway, with one hand gripping the wheel tightly enough to hurt. At 68 years old, most people saw him as a quiet widower who spent too much time fishing and repairing broken electronics. What Jason Carter never understood was that Michael Bennett had spent 35 years commanding Coast Guard rescue operations in storms that terrified other men. And when people he loved were in danger, he showed up. Every single time. Before leaving the neighborhood, Michael made one final call. Robert Hayes answered on the 2nd ring, his voice groggy with sleep. Mike? Michael stared through the windshield toward the rain-covered highway. She used the code. Silence. Then Robert's tone changed immediately. How bad? I don't know yet. Another pause. I'm coming with you. Michael hung up and pressed harder on the gas pedal. Somewhere ahead in Mount Pleasant, his daughter was waiting. And deep down, Michael already feared one terrible truth. This was not going to be one bad night. This had probably been happening for years. The drive from Charleston Harbor to Mount Pleasant normally took less than 30 minutes at night. That evening, it felt endless. Rain streaked across Michael Bennett's windshield while the old Ford pickup rattled softly beneath him. Headlights reflected across wet pavement, stretching into long, blurry lines under the storm clouds hanging low over the city. Michael barely noticed any of it. All he could think about were the small things he had ignored. Emily canceling family dinners at the last minute. Sophie going strangely quiet whenever Jason entered the room. The way Emily apologized constantly, even for things that were never her fault. 6 months earlier, during a Sunday barbecue, Jason had mocked Emily in front of everyone because she forgot hamburger buns at the grocery store. It had not been yelling. Worse. That cold, humiliating tone people use when they want others to laugh at someone beside them. Emily laughed it off too quickly. Michael remembered seeing her hand shake while she reached for the ketchup bottle. At the time, he told himself it was stress. Now, sitting alone in the truck with thunder rolling overhead, he realized how badly he wanted to believe that. His phone buzzed through the dashboard compartment. Robert Hayes. I'm 5 minutes behind you, Robert said. You armed? Michael kept his eyes on the road. Yeah. Good. Robert had spent 20 years working federal investigations before retiring near Savannah. Age had slowed his knees, but not his instincts. If Robert sounded worried, things were serious. As Michael crossed the Arthur Ravenel Bridge, Charleston Harbor disappeared behind him in dark waves and scattered marina lights. Ahead, Mount Pleasant sat silent beneath the rain. Emily's subdivision appeared almost deserted when Michael finally turned into it around 11:08 p.m. Identical 2-story homes lined the streets with perfectly trimmed lawns and decorative trees bending under the storm wind. Robert's SUV pulled in quietly behind him. Michael parked across from Emily's house and shut off the engine. For a moment, Neither man moved. Then they heard shouting. Even through the rain, Michael recognized Jason's voice instantly. Sharp, angry, control slipping. A loud crash echoed from inside the house. Glass. Then came something worse. A little girl crying. Not loud crying. Scared crying. The kind children make when they are trying not to be heard. Robert glanced toward Michael carefully. You want police now? Michael stared at the glowing kitchen window. Then he saw movement. Emily. Only for a second, but long enough to see fear on her face. Michael opened the truck door immediately. Cold rain soaked through his jacket as he crossed the street without running, but moving fast enough that Robert hurried beside him. Halfway up the walkway, Jason screamed something from inside the house. Then silence. Michael reached the front porch. His heart pounded painfully against his ribs. For the first time in years, he felt the same cold clarity he used to feel during rescue emergencies at sea. Something terrible was happening inside that house, and his daughter was afraid. Michael grabbed the doorknob, unlocked. He pushed the front door open, and everything changed. The smell hit Michael first. Whiskey. Burned food. Broken glass. The living room lamp had been knocked sideways onto the carpet, and shattered pieces of a wine glass glittered near the hallway entrance. Rain thundered softly against the windows, while the television flickered silently in the corner of the room. Emily stood near the dining table, clutching one arm tightly against her ribs. There was blood on her lower lip. Not much, but enough. Michael stopped breathing for half a second. Behind her legs stood Sophie wearing pink dolphin pajamas, her small hands gripping her mother's sweater tightly while tears streamed down her cheeks. And near the kitchen island stood Jason Carter, half drunk, holding a whiskey tumbler like none of this was unusual. The moment Jason saw Michael, his entire expression shifted. "Michael," he said quickly, "this isn't what it looks like." Michael had heard that sentence before. Men always used it when the truth was already obvious. Sophie looked up and saw her grandfather. "Grandpa!" She ran toward him immediately. Michael bent down and caught her against his chest. Her tiny body shook violently as she buried her face into his jacket. "It's okay," he whispered softly. "I've got you." Robert stepped inside behind him and quietly closed the front door. Jason forced an awkward laugh. "Couples fight sometimes, right? Everybody's emotional." Emily flinched slightly at the sound of his voice. Small movement. Tiny. But Michael noticed it instantly. Years of commanding rescue crews had taught him how fear lived inside the body, long before words ever admitted it. And Emily was terrified. Robert crouched beside Sophie carefully. "Hey, kiddo," he said gently. "You think you can help me look for cookies in the kitchen?" Sophie nodded weakly. Emily still would not look directly at her father. That hurt Michael more than the blood. Jason kept talking too fast. "She threw a glass at me first. You know how stressed she gets lately." Michael looked around the room silently. Dining chair overturned. Broken plate near the sink. Emily's trembling hands. Then Jason stepped toward her again. Emily instinctively leaned backward. That was enough. Michael straightened slowly. "We're leaving," he said calmly. Jason blinked. "What?" "Emily and Sophie are coming with me tonight." Jason laughed once without humor. "You don't get to walk into my house and take my family." "My family." Michael noticed how men like Jason only use those words when control started slipping away. Emily quietly moved toward the hallway where Sophie stood beside Robert. Jason saw it instantly and grabbed Emily's arm hard enough that she gasped. Something cold passed through Michael then. Not anger. Clarity. He walked directly toward Jason until only a few feet separated them. Jason was younger, taller, stronger physically. But his confidence changed the moment Michael looked him in the eye. "Take your hand off my daughter," Michael said quietly. For a second, Nobody moved. Then Jason released her arm with a bitter smirk. "What are you gonna do, old man?" he muttered. Michael did not answer, because at that exact moment, red and blue lights flashed through the rain outside the front windows. Police. Robert had called them the second they entered the house. Jason immediately stepped backward, his expression changing again. That frightened Michael most of all. The switch. 1 second rage. The next second, calm suburban husband. By the time 2 officers entered through the doorway, Jason looked exhausted instead of dangerous. Emily sat silently at the kitchen table, holding frozen vegetables against her cheek while Officer Reynolds spoke gently. "Ma'am," the officer asked carefully, "did your husband strike you tonight?" Emily hesitated. Then she looked toward Jason. Huge mistake. Fear always checks the room first. Michael closed his eyes briefly. Jason spoke before she could answer. "This whole thing got blown out of proportion." Michael nearly put him through the wall. Instead, he stood perfectly still beside the kitchen counter while rainwater dripped from his jacket onto the hardwood floor. Finally, Emily whispered something so quietly, Michael almost missed it. "Please." Her voice cracked. Then she looked at her father for the first time that night. "Dad, please don't leave us here." The drive back to Charleston felt quieter than the storm outside. Sophie had fallen asleep curled beneath one of Michael's old Coast Guard blankets in the back seat, while rain continued pounding against the truck windows. Robert followed behind them in his SUV, the entire way across the bridge, without saying much over the phone. There was nothing left to say, yet. Not until Emily finally talked. Michael's waterfront home sat near the marina just outside Charleston Harbor, tucked between weathered oak trees and rows of small fishing boats rocking against their slips. Emily used to love that house when she was younger, back when life still felt safe. The porch light glowed softly as Michael unlocked the front door and guided everyone inside. Sophie barely woke while Robert carried her carefully to the guest bedroom upstairs. Emily stood silently in the kitchen afterward, staring at the coffee maker like she had forgotten what it was for. Michael poured her a cup anyway. She wrapped both hands around the mug, but never drank from it. Her lip looked worse under proper lighting. So did the bruise forming beneath her sleeve. Robert noticed it too, but wisely said nothing. Around 2 a.m, Robert quietly grabbed his jacket. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said near the front door. Michael nodded once. Then Robert lowered his voice. "This didn't start tonight." It was not a question. Michael looked toward the kitchen where Emily sat motionless beneath the yellow overhead light. "No," he admitted quietly. "I think it started a long time ago." Robert studied him carefully for a moment. "Don't blame yourself too fast," he said. "People hide what they're ashamed of." Then he disappeared into the rain. Michael did not sleep. At 4 a.m, he sat alone in the dark kitchen, listening to the ice maker crack fresh cubes into the freezer tray while thunder rolled far out across the harbor. Eventually, Emily walked quietly into the room, wearing one of his old navy sweatshirts she still kept in the hall closet. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then she asked the question that nearly broke him. "Do you hate me?" Michael looked up immediately. "Hate you?" "For staying." The exhaustion in her voice sounded older than 35. Michael stared at his daughter for a long moment before answering. "No," he said softly. "I hate that you thought you had to." Emily's face crumpled instantly. Not dramatic crying. Exhausted crying. The kind that comes after carrying fear for too many years. And finally, the truth started coming out. Jason controlled nearly every bank account. He checked her phone regularly. He criticized her clothes, her parenting, even the way she talked during social events. If she disagreed with him privately, he picked fights before family gatherings so she would seem unstable afterward. Michael felt physically sick listening to it. "How long?" he finally asked quietly. Emily stared into the untouched coffee. "A while." "How long, Emily?" She swallowed hard. "He hit me for the first time after Sophie turned 2. Something inside Michael's chest tightened painfully. For a second, he honestly could not breathe. He stood too quickly, walked straight into the garage, and slammed his fist into a metal storage cabinet hard enough to dent it. Pain shot through his hand instantly. Good. He deserved it. A few moments later, Emily appeared quietly in the garage doorway. "You never hit, Mom," she whispered. Michael laughed once without humor. "No," he admitted, "but apparently I missed a hell of a lot." Rainwater dripped steadily outside, while silence filled the garage between them. Then Emily spoke again. "He always apologized afterward," she said softly. "That's what made it confusing." Michael leaned heavily against the workbench. "How bad is the money situation?" Emily hesitated. That hesitation frightened him immediately. Finally, she whispered, "Worse than you think." The next morning, Robert arrived carrying breakfast sandwiches and a legal pad full of handwritten notes. Michael knew that look. Robert had already started digging, and whatever he found was bad enough that he came back before sunrise. Robert Hayes spread the documents across Michael's kitchen table, with the quiet patience of a man who had spent most of his life uncovering things people desperately wanted hidden. Outside, gray morning clouds hung low over Charleston Harbor, while gulls drifted above the marina. Sophie sat in the living room floor watching cartoons beneath a blanket, unaware that the adults in the kitchen were slowly discovering how deep the damage really went. Emily looked exhausted. Michael looked worse. Robert adjusted his reading glasses and tapped one of the papers. "These are public financial filings tied to Jason's business reimbursements," he explained calmly. "Nothing illegal about accessing them." Emily folded her arms tightly. "What exactly are we looking at?" Robert slid several printed bank summaries toward her. "Hotel charges, luxury restaurants, jewelry purchases, a private apartment lease in Savannah." Michael's stomach tightened immediately. Emily stared at the papers silently for several seconds before whispering, "No." Robert nodded carefully. "I'm pretty sure Jason's been having an affair for at least a year." The room went still. Michael watched his daughter's face slowly collapse inward, like she had expected this truth long before hearing it out loud. "What's her name?" she asked quietly. Robert hesitated. "Olivia Turner." Emily closed her eyes immediately. "I knew it," she whispered. Michael looked up sharply. "You knew?" "Not completely." Tears filled her eyes again. "But there were messages, weird late meetings. Weekends he suddenly had conferences in Savannah." Robert slid another document across the table. "There's more." Michael picked up the page. The moment he saw the account numbers, his pulse spiked. Sophie's education fund, or what was left of it. For nearly 15 years, Michael had quietly contributed to that account after every birthday, every Christmas, every retirement bonus he could spare. It was never about wealth. It was about security, about giving his granddaughter something untouched by hardship. Michael looked at Emily slowly. "How much is missing?" Emily could not answer immediately. That silence terrified him more than numbers ever could. Finally, she whispered, "Almost all of it." The kitchen suddenly felt too small. Michael sat down heavily in the nearest chair because his knees no longer felt steady. Robert spoke carefully. "Looks like Jason convinced Emily to sign digital refinancing paperwork over the last couple years. He buried transfers inside legitimate tax documents and investment forms." Emily wiped her face quickly. "He always handled everything financial," she said weakly. "He said I worried too much." Classic manipulation. Michael knew it immediately. Overload someone with paperwork until they stop questioning anything. Robert leaned back slightly. "There's also evidence he charged personal expenses through company reimbursement accounts." Michael stared at the documents. Golf resorts, luxury bars, weekend hotel suites. Meanwhile, Emily had been clipping grocery coupons and reusing Sophie's school supplies. Something dark moved through him then. Not just anger, shame. Because he had helped Jason once, recommended him for interviews, loaned him money during hard years, welcomed him into the family. Emily suddenly looked at her father carefully. "You warned me once," she whispered. Michael frowned slightly. "When?" 3 years ago, Thanksgiving. He remembered instantly. Jason had spent half the afternoon flirting with a younger real estate agent while Emily cleaned dishes alone in the kitchen. Michael had quietly told her, "A man who enjoys embarrassing you in public usually behaves worse in private." Emily defended Jason for nearly 20 minutes afterward. Now she sat at the kitchen table, looking emotionally hollowed out by years of excuses. "I should have listened," she whispered. "No," Michael answered quietly. "I should have pushed harder." A knock interrupted the silence. Robert stood and opened the front door. A woman in her late 50s entered, carrying a leather briefcase and a calm expression sharpened by decades inside courtrooms. Karen Mitchell, family attorney. Sharp gray eyes, steady posture, the kind of person who walked into chaos without flinching. She shook Michael's hand once before sitting at the kitchen table. Then she opened the folder slowly. For nearly an hour, she reviewed bank statements, photographs, account transfers, and printed messages. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. "Emily," she said gently, "your husband may have committed financial abuse, fraud, and possibly embezzlement." Emily looked terrified hearing the words spoken aloud. "But we're married," she whispered weakly. "He said that meant everything belonged to both of us." Karen shook her head calmly. "That's not how the law works." Emily's composure finally cracked again. "What if he takes Sophie?" There it was. The real fear beneath everything else. Karen's voice softened slightly. Family courts take documented abuse and financial deception very seriously, especially when children are involved. Michael looked toward the living room where Sophie laughed quietly at cartoons for the first time in days. And deep down, he realized something painful. This was no longer about saving a marriage. It was about saving what remained of his daughter's life. The first week after Emily left, Jason felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful. Just unfamiliar. Michael noticed it most during the mornings. No tense phone calls. No sudden mood shifts. No nervous checking of text messages every few minutes. At first, Emily still moved around the house like someone waiting for an explosion that never came. She apologized constantly for little things, for leaving dishes in the sink, for taking too long in the shower, for existing too loudly in someone else's space. Michael never realized how deeply fear could train a person until he watched his own daughter live inside it. But slowly, small things began changing. Sophie laughed more. That was the first real sign. One afternoon, Michael looked through the kitchen window and saw Sophie drawing with sidewalk chalk near the marina, while Emily sat beside her, smiling softly beneath the sunlight. Not forcing a smile. A real one. Michael had not seen that expression on his daughter's face in years. Later that evening, Emily opened a brand new checking account under only her own name, while Karen Mitchell guided her through the paperwork. "It may feel small," Karen said, "but this matters." Emily nodded nervously. Every step away from Jason still felt dangerous. Meanwhile, Jason's messages became increasingly unpredictable. Some mornings, he sounded apologetic. "I miss my family. I know I messed up. I'm getting help." Other times, the tone shifted completely. "Your father is poisoning you against me. No decent man would interfere in a marriage like this." Then came the guilt. Sophie deserves both parents. And finally, the cruelty. "You really think anyone else would want you now?" Michael read that last message while sitting inside his truck outside a grocery store near Charleston Harbor. For a moment, he honestly considered driving straight to Mount Pleasant and putting Jason through a wall. Instead, he shut off the engine and sat there, gripping the steering wheel until the anger passed. Age teaches men dangerous lessons about self-control. One bad decision can destroy 50 years of discipline. By the time he returned home, Karen and Robert were already sitting at the dining table, surrounded by folders. Robert looked up immediately. We found something bigger. Michael set his truck keys down slowly. How much bigger? Karen slid several printed expense reports toward him. Jason had apparently been billing personal luxury expenses through his company for over a year. Golf weekends, private dinners, jewelry purchases, hotel suites, hidden apartment payments tied to Savannah. Michael flipped through the pages in disbelief. Jesus Christ. Emily sat down beside him slowly, her face pale. He told me we were struggling financially, she whispered. Robert nodded grimly. People like Jason build entire identities around appearance. Once that image starts cracking, everything underneath usually falls apart fast. Karen pointed towards several highlighted entries. These reimbursements alone could trigger internal investigations if his employer reviews them closely. Emily looked frightened again. I don't want revenge, she said quietly. Karen's expression softened slightly. This isn't revenge. This is accountability. Silence settled over the room. Outside, Sophie rode her bike crookedly along the driveway, while seagulls drifted above the harbor in the late afternoon sunlight. Then Robert pulled out another photo. A brunette woman laughing beside Jason outside an upscale rooftop restaurant in Savannah. Olivia Turner. Even from the picture, Michael could see the arrogance in Jason's posture. The confidence of a man who still believed he controlled the narrative. Emily stared at the image for several seconds before quietly removing her wedding ring. No dramatic speech. No tears. She simply placed it on the table beside her untouched coffee cup. Michael felt something shift in the room right then. Not anger. Not grief. Finality. Karen noticed it too. She closed the folder carefully. There's a fundraising gala next month at Harborview Inn, she said calmly. Jason's company executives will all be there. Michael frowned. What does that matter? Karen looked directly at him. Because by then, his entire world may already be collapsing. For the first time since leaving Mount Pleasant, Emily did not look afraid. She looked tired. But underneath that exhaustion, Michael finally saw something returning to her eyes. Resolve. The following weeks unfolded quietly. That was the strange part. Michael had spent most of his life believing disasters arrive loudly. Alarms, storms, helicopters cutting through black water at midnight. But real destruction often happened silently. Paperwork. Emails. Bank records. Carefully timed conversations behind closed office doors. Karen Mitchell understood that better than anyone. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, she spread several folders across Michael's dining table while Charleston Harbor disappeared beneath heavy gray fog outside the windows. We don't need drama, she explained calmly. We need pressure. Robert nodded beside her. And pressure works best when people don't see it coming. Emily sat quietly near the kitchen counter, listening, while Sophie colored dolphins at the table nearby. Michael noticed how Emily still tensed every time Jason's name entered the conversation. Healing was happening. But fear leaves scars long after bruises disappear. Karen tapped one folder carefully. Jason's company has internal compliance policies. Expense fraud alone could trigger an investigation. Michael crossed his arms. So what happens? We provide documentation anonymously, Karen replied. Not accusations, facts. Robert slid another file forward. And Olivia Turner's husband deserves the truth, too. Emily looked uncomfortable immediately. I don't want to destroy anyone's marriage. Karen's expression softened slightly. Emily, their marriage already included lies. You didn't create that. Silence settled over the room. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the porch railing. Michael studied his daughter carefully. 3 weeks earlier, she would have defended Jason automatically. Now, she simply looked exhausted by protecting him. That alone felt like progress. Later that evening, Michael found Emily standing alone on the back porch overlooking the marina. Wind moved softly through her hair, while sailboats rocked gently against their ropes below. You okay? He asked. Emily nodded faintly. then shook her head. I don't even know what normal feels like anymore. Michael leaned against the porch railing beside her. You will. She laughed weakly. You sound pretty sure. I've rescued people during hurricanes, Michael said quietly. The hardest part isn't surviving the storm. Emily glanced toward him. It's learning you're safe afterward. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emily slowly pulled her wedding ring from her pocket. Michael watched her stare at it silently beneath the porch light. I kept thinking if I waited long enough, she whispered, the man I married would come back. Michael looked out toward the dark harbor water. Maybe parts of him were real once. Emily's eyes filled slightly, but not the parts that stayed. She placed the ring on the porch railing and left it there. The next morning, Karen received confirmation that Jason's company had quietly opened an internal review regarding expense irregularities. No confrontation yet. No public scandal. Just the first crack. Robert, meanwhile, tracked Olivia Turner through social media records and business event photographs tied to Savannah hotels and Charleston conferences. The pattern was obvious now. Jason had not been careless because he thought he was untouchable. Michael hated men like that. Not loud criminals. The polished ones. The men who shook hands at charity events while destroying people privately behind closed doors. One evening, Jason called repeatedly from blocked numbers. Michael finally answered after the fourth attempt. For several seconds, there was only breathing. Then Jason spoke. You think you're protecting her? Michael remained silent. She's confused right now, Jason continued. You're making this worse. Michael stared out across the marina while fishing boats drifted beneath orange sunset light. No, he said calmly. You already did that yourself. Jason's voice hardened instantly. You've always looked down on me. Michael almost laughed. Because that was the lie men like Jason needed most. That accountability came from hatred instead of consequences. I welcomed you into my family, Michael answered quietly. You destroyed that on your own. Jason hung up immediately. That night, Karen called with another update. There's a fundraising gala at Harborview Inn in 2 weeks, she explained. Jason's entire executive team will attend. Michael frowned slightly. And? Karen's tone remained calm. Internal investigators will probably attend too. Michael stood silently in the kitchen after the call ended. Outside, Sophie laughed while chasing fireflies across the backyard. Inside, Emily sat peacefully on the couch reading beside the lamp. For the first time in years, his daughter looked like someone beginning to breathe again. And somewhere deep down, Michael realized something important. Jason still believed he controlled the story. He had no idea the ending had already begun. The Harborview Inn overlooked Charleston Harbor like it had been designed specifically for wealthy people pretending their lives were simpler than they actually were. Glass walls, soft jazz, expensive wine. The kind of place where men in tailored suits discussed charitable foundations while checking stock prices beneath the table. By 7 o'clock, the ballroom was already crowded. Executives, local politicians, retired military officers, women wearing diamonds bright enough to catch chandelier light from across the room. Michael Bennett stood near the back bar nursing a glass of iced tea while Robert Hayes quietly observed the room beside him. Neither man looked nervous, but both were watching carefully. Michael wore a navy blazer and gray slacks without any military pins or decorations. Most people probably assumed he was another retired grandfather attending for free salmon and polite conversation. Perfect. Across the ballroom, Karen Mitchell moved through conversations calmly, greeting donors and attorneys with effortless professionalism. Everything appeared normal. That was the point. Then Jason arrived. And somehow, he still looked confident. Tailored charcoal suit. Perfect haircut. Bright white smile. Olivia Turner walked beside him in a silver dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. Michael watched several guests notice them immediately. Nobody said anything aloud. Upper middle class America had perfected that skill decades ago. See everything. Pretend nothing happened. Jason moved through the ballroom, shaking hands like a politician during election season. Relaxed. Charming. Untouchable. At one point, Michael overheard him laughing loudly beside several executives. Big things coming soon, Jason bragged. Companies finally recognizing talent around here. Robert muttered quietly beside Michael. That man could drown in a bathtub and still think he invented water. Michael almost smiled. Almost. Around 8 o'clock, Jason finally spotted him near the bar. His expression changed immediately. Not fear. Annoyance. Like Michael had shown up wearing muddy boots to a country club. Well, Jason said while approaching with a bourbon glass in hand. Didn't expect retired grandpa night. Michael sipped his iced tea calmly. How's Savannah these days? He asked. Jason's jaw tightened slightly. Tiny reaction, but enough. Olivia looked uncomfortable immediately beside him. Jason recovered fast. You know, he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, Emily's really struggling emotionally right now. There it was. The setup. Michael recognized manipulation instantly. Jason wanted witnesses hearing his version before the truth surfaced. He wanted people quietly questioning Emily's stability. Michael looked directly into his eyes. My daughter's doing better than she has in years. For half a second, Jason's fake smile cracked. Then it returned immediately. Well, he replied, swirling bourbon inside the glass. Everybody tells themselves comforting stories. He walked away after that. But Michael noticed him checking over his shoulder twice. Pressure. The cracks were spreading. Across the ballroom, Robert quietly checked his watch. Should be starting soon, he murmured. Right on cue, 2 men in dark suits entered through the side doors. Corporate investigators. Jason noticed them almost instantly, and for the first time all evening, genuine panic flickered across his face. Meanwhile, another figure entered the ballroom from the main lobby. Tall. Controlled. Mid-40s. Mark Turner. Olivia's husband. Olivia saw him immediately and went pale. Jason moved toward her fast. Too fast. Mark reached them within seconds. No shouting. No dramatic scene. Just controlled anger sharpened into something dangerous. We need to talk, Mark said quietly. Olivia grabbed his arm nervously. Mark, not here. You spent 6 months sleeping with him, using hotel rooms paid for by his company, Mark interrupted calmly. Seems like here works just fine. Nearby conversations stopped instantly. That was the thing about scandals. People pretended not to stare while staring harder than ever. Jason stepped forward quickly. This isn't the place for this. One of the investigators approached at the same moment. Mr. Carter, he said professionally, we need a private conversation regarding several expense reports. Jason laughed too loudly. Expense reports? Nobody else laughed. The ballroom atmosphere shifted immediately. Executives whispered. Phones appeared discreetly beneath tables. Olivia looked trapped. And then Jason saw something that finally shook him. Emily had entered the ballroom beside Karen. Simple, dark blue dress. Hair tied back. No fear in her face anymore. Jason stared at her like someone watching control disappear in real time. Because for the first time since Michael met him, Jason Carter realized he was no longer the smartest man in the room. The ballroom had gone almost completely silent. Not fully silent. Just the strange kind of silence wealthy people create when something ugly finally becomes impossible to ignore. Soft jazz still played somewhere near the stage. Wine glasses still clinked. But nobody was paying attention to the fundraiser anymore. Every eye in the room had shifted toward Jason Carter. Jason looked around the ballroom desperately, searching for control that no longer existed. The corporate investigator stood calmly beside him, holding a thin, black folder. Mr. Carter, he repeated professionally, We need to discuss several reimbursement discrepancies and unauthorized expense filings. Jason forced another laugh. Too loud. Too sharp. You're doing this here? He snapped. The investigator remained expressionless. We attempted multiple private meetings this week. That landed. Several executives nearby immediately avoided eye contact with Jason. Because now they understood something important. This was not rumor anymore. This was documentation. Olivia Turner stepped backward slowly, as if physical distance might somehow separate her from the disaster unfolding around her. Her husband Mark looked emotionally exhausted more than angry now. That hit Michael harder than shouting would have. Real betrayal rarely looked dramatic. Usually it just looked tired. Jason suddenly turned toward Emily. There, he said loudly, pointing across the ballroom. This is what she wanted. Emily did not move. Michael stood several feet behind her beside Karen and Robert, watching carefully. Jason walked toward Emily quickly enough that security near the ballroom entrance immediately became alert. You've blown this completely out of proportion, Jason hissed. Emily's face stayed calm. That unsettled him more than anger ever could. You let your father destroy our marriage. Michael saw several nearby guests glance toward him. Retired commander. Quiet widower. Protective father. He said nothing. Because this was no longer his moment. It belonged to Emily. Jason stepped closer. For one brief second, Michael saw something dangerous flash across Jason's face. Not love. Not regret. Fear. Fear of losing control publicly. Say something, Jason demanded. Emily looked at him silently for several seconds. Then she spoke softly enough that people leaned closer to hear. I stayed quiet for years. The ballroom remained frozen. Jason's jaw tightened immediately. Emily continued calmly. I defended you. I protected you. I kept making excuses for you. Her voice never shook. And somehow, that made every word hit harder. But I'm done protecting you now. Simple sentence. Fatal sentence. Jason actually looked stunned. As if he genuinely believed she would never stop covering for him. People like Jason never understand the moment power leaves them. Because they mistake silence for loyalty. The investigator stepped forward again. Mr. Carter, we need you to come with us. Jason ignored him completely. Instead, he looked directly at Michael. Pure anger now. This is because of you. Michael met his stare calmly. No, he answered quietly. This is because of you. Jason opened his mouth again, probably searching for another lie big enough to save him. But nobody was listening anymore. Not the executives. Not Olivia. Not even the guests pretending to avoid eye contact. The room had already judged him. Security approached carefully from both sides. Jason's confidence finally cracked completely then. You think she'll be happier without me? He snapped toward Michael. Emily answered before Michael could. She'll be safe. That hit harder than any insult ever could. Jason looked at her like he no longer recognized the woman standing in front of him. And maybe he didn't, because fear had disappeared from her face. For the first time all night, Michael realized something profound. Emily was no longer surviving. She was choosing herself. Security quietly escorted Jason toward the ballroom exit while conversation slowly resumed in nervous whispers around the room. Jason kept looking backward as he walked away. Still expecting someone to rescue him. Still believing charm could undo consequences. But the truth had finally outrun him. Karen exhaled slowly beside Michael. That's over, she murmured. Michael looked toward Emily. No, he said quietly. Then he watched his daughter stand a little straighter beneath the ballroom lights. It's finally starting. 4 months after the gala, Michael Bennett stood barefoot in his kitchen making blueberry pancakes while Sophie sat at the counter explaining very seriously why dolphins were smarter than sharks. Sharks just bite stuff, she said confidently while swinging her legs beneath the stool. Dolphins actually think. Michael flipped a pancake carefully. Sounds reasonable to me. Sophie grinned proudly before stealing 2 chocolate chips from the mixing bowl when she thought he was not looking. Saturday mornings had quietly become their tradition. Cartoons playing softly in the living room. Coffee brewing before sunrise. Fishing boats drifting across Charleston Harbor outside the kitchen windows. Normal life. Michael had spent months realizing how valuable normal actually was. Not silence hiding fear. Not careful conversations designed to avoid conflict. Real peace. The legal fallout surrounding Jason moved slower than television made people believe. Internal audits. Divorce filings. Financial investigations. Court hearings. Karen Mitchell handled most of it, while Emily focused on rebuilding herself, one small step at a time. Jason lost his executive position quietly after the company confirmed fraudulent reimbursements and policy violations. Several civil investigations remained ongoing, though Michael eventually stopped caring about the details. That surprised him. For weeks after the gala, Michael thought satisfaction would come from watching Jason lose everything. But revenge faded faster than he expected. What remained instead was guilt. He kept replaying old memories inside his head. Emily canceling family holidays. Sal's explained too quickly. Sophie flinching whenever doors slammed. All the signs he softened because confronting them felt uncomfortable. One evening near sunset, Michael finally apologized. He and Emily sat together on the back porch, watching sailboats drift slowly across the harbor beneath orange light. "I should have seen it sooner," he admitted quietly. Emily shook her head immediately. "You saw parts of it." "Not enough." "No," she said softly. "You saw exactly what I let people see." That hurt too, because it was true. Abuse trained entire families into performing normalcy. Jason controlled the room. Emily protected the peace. And Michael respected boundaries instead of asking harder questions. Only Sophie had reacted honestly from the beginning. Children always know more than adults realize. A few weeks later, Emily accepted part-time work at an elementary school counseling office in Charleston. Nothing glamorous. But the first afternoon she came home smiling about one of her students drawing superheroes with dinosaur heads. Michael sat alone in the garage afterward and cried quietly where nobody could see him. Not from sadness. Relief. Because laughter had returned to his daughter's voice. Healing rarely arrived dramatically. Most of the time it appeared quietly through ordinary moments. Coffee cups left in the sink. Open curtains. Music playing again. Michael also began rebuilding Sophie's education fund little by little. Karen helped recover part of the missing money through legal settlements, and Michael quietly added whatever he could each month from his retirement savings. One afternoon, Sophie rode her bicycle crookedly down the driveway, while Emily jogged beside her, laughing. "Keep pedaling." "I am pedaling." "You're steering into the bushes." Michael watched from the porch, pretending to read the newspaper. Peace. Actual peace. Then one evening, near the end of summer, Michael's phone rang from a blocked number. He answered before checking the screen. Jason's voice sounded smaller somehow. Not dramatic. Just worn down. "Can I talk to Emily?" Michael stared silently across the dark marina. "No." Long pause. Then Jason spoke again. "I loved her." Michael closed his eyes briefly. Maybe Jason believed that. Maybe parts of it were even true. But love without safety becomes something dangerous. "You probably did," Michael answered quietly. Jason sounded confused by the response. Michael continued, "But you still destroyed her." Silence filled the line. Then Michael ended the call calmly, without another word. Later that night, Sophie sat beside him on the dock eating a melting popsicle while boats rocked gently nearby. "Grandpa?" "Yeah?" "Were you a hero in the Coast Guard?" Michael laughed softly. "No, sweetheart." Sophie frowned. "Mom says you saved us." Michael looked out across Charleston Harbor while warm evening wind moved across the water. For most of his life, he thought strength meant staying calm during storms. Now he understood something different. Sometimes, strength simply meant showing up before it was too late. Summer slowly gave way to early fall along Charleston Harbor. The air turned cooler in the mornings, carrying the smell of salt water and drifting leaves through Michael Bennett's open kitchen windows. Fishing boats still moved across the marina before sunrise, but the crowds along the waterfront had thinned, leaving the neighborhood quieter than usual. Michael liked the quiet now. Not because silence erased pain, because this silence no longer hid fear. One Saturday morning, Sophie sat cross-legged on the living room floor, building an uneven blanket fort while cartoons played softly in the background. Emily stood in the kitchen laughing at something on her phone while coffee brewed nearby. Michael watched both of them carefully from the dining table. Months earlier, Emily moved through life like someone bracing for impact. Now she moved like someone finally learning how to breathe normally again. The difference was subtle, but enormous. "Mom!" Sophie shouted from the blanket fort. "Grandpa's cheating at Uno again!" Michael raised an eyebrow. "I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about." "You hid cards!" "That sounds like a very serious accusation." Emily laughed harder than he had heard in years. The sound stopped Michael for a moment. Not because it was unusual anymore, because it no longer sounded fragile. Healing had settled into the house quietly over time. Therapy appointments, school lunches, movie nights, laundry baskets left unfolded until morning. Ordinary life slowly rebuilding itself. And somewhere along the way, Michael realized something unexpected. He had been healing too. For months, he carried guilt like extra weight on his shoulders. The missed warning signs, the excuses he accepted, the times he chose politeness over difficult conversations. But Emily eventually helped him understand something important. Abuse survives inside silence, and silence rarely belongs to only one person. One evening near sunset, Michael sat alone on the back porch with a cup of coffee, watching golden light stretch across the harbor water. Emily stepped outside carrying a folded blanket. "Sophie finally fell asleep," she said softly. Michael smiled faintly. "She still kicks people in her sleep?" "Violently." Emily sat beside him while sailboats drifted quietly in the distance. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Emily looked toward him carefully. "You saved us, Dad." Michael stared down into his coffee. "No," he answered after a moment. "You saved yourself. I just showed up." Emily shook her head gently. "You came when I needed someone." The breeze moved softly through the porch screens. Michael thought back to the message that changed everything. Dead. Blue Harbor. 3 simple words. A quiet cry for help. And how close he came to ignoring the signs long before that night. "I used to think strength meant handling things alone," Emily admitted quietly. Michael nodded slowly. "A lot of people do." She leaned her head lightly against his shoulder, like she used to as a little girl after thunderstorms. "Not anymore." That night, after everyone went to bed, Michael walked quietly onto the dock behind the house. The harbor was calm. Moonlight shimmered across the black water, while distant boat engines echoed softly through the darkness. Michael sat at the edge of the dock, remembering storms he survived during 35 years in the Coast Guard. Towering waves, rescue helicopters, men terrified at sea. Back then he believed courage looked loud. Now he understood differently. Sometimes courage looked like a frightened daughter sending 3 words after years of silence. Sometimes courage looked like leaving. Sometimes it looked like surviving long enough to laugh again. A few days later, Sophie asked him another question while they sat together feeding crumbs to seagulls near the marina. "Grandpa?" "Yeah, sweetheart?" "Are heroes real?" Michael smiled softly. Then he looked toward Emily, walking along the harbor with sunlight warming her face, while laughter drifted across the water beside her. "Yes," he said quietly. Sophie's eyes widened. "Really?" Michael nodded once. Heroes are just people who show up when it matters. Sophie thought about that very seriously before smiling. And for the first time in a very long while, Michael Bennett finally felt something he thought he had lost forever. Peace.